Dr. Catherine Barrett, thank you so much for joining us. Lovely to see you again.
Alan, thank you for the invitation.
Tell me how institutions react to reports or the suspicion that somebody living with dementia might have been abused.
Well, it varies enormously. There are some services that do it really well and respond in really supportive ways for older women and their families. But I get contacted by a lot of family members who feel that they haven't been heard, and they also feel that the responses of service providers are defensive. And there's also too a sense that when they're reporting sexual abuse, that service providers are saying, well, you know, it couldn't possibly be the case, particularly where there's a staff member involved, that there's a sort of a disbelief that, you know, a younger man would sexually assault an older woman. So I'm hearing when family members ring me, often they're really quite upset. And one of the first things that I do with them is say to them, I am sorry that happened to your mother. And quite often they'll break down and say, you know, that's the first time that I feel that I've been heard.
Yeah.
So we've got a long way to go in terms of responding in positive and constructive and really helpful ways.
Yeah. And I've heard you say in the past, yes, that couldn't possibly have happened. That young man is married with children. Why would he be sexually interested in an older woman? Is that part of the problem, the notion that a rape is a crime of passion rather than power?
Yeah, look, it is part of the problem. Ageism is a huge barrier here to preventing sexual abuse of older women. There is a belief that because older women there is a myth that older women aren't sexually attractive, so therefore they do not experience sexual assault. And that, as you said, that belief that, you know, he wouldn't do that because he's younger and he's married, and that's a real barrier. People don't understand that this is about power, and that actually from the research we know that older women, particularly older women who are cognitively impaired or unable to speak, are being targeted by perpetrators who recognise that they will get away with it, or most probably will get away with it, because older women won't be able to speak or won't be believed.
Yeah. Kerry Chikarovsky, do you think that there's a widespread fear of this among older women in our society?
Well, I think it's not just amongst older women. I think that people who put their, families who put their parents into nursing homes, I think are going to be very concerned about these statistics, because when you it's a very difficult. I put my father into a nursing home. You know, he was only there for a week, and then he went to God. But the decision to actually put someone into a nursing home is a very difficult decision. You know, you're taking away the independence of a whole lot of people. To think that you're putting them into an environment where you might be putting them at risk, I mean, that is going to be horrendous for the victims, but it's also horrendous for the families. And we saw that when we saw that son talking about what had happened to his mother. I mean, I've known that there's been abuse in nursing homes for some time. A lot of it was physical in the past. We've had, Bronwyn Bishop did a very good job a long time ago lifting the standards in relation to nursing homes so that there wouldn't be the physical abuse. But to hear that there's this level of sexual abuse in homes will be distressing for every single person who's either in those homes now, but as I said, as much for their families as well.
Tesneem, it's interesting to think about. There is that widespread fear, isn't there? There's an anxiety. There's a whole heap of drivers of that anxiety about residential care, but also about people coming into the home to support older people in the home. To what extent do you think that there is an understanding among older women that this can happen, and a fear that this can happen, that is as widespread, perhaps, thinking about royal commissions, there's 2 royal commissions, as the understanding about the abuse of banks was? It's not something that kind of is in the media a lot, but it is understood.
It's just not on the radar. You don't assume that an institution for elderly adults is going to be a place where that will happen, where you can have your trust so violated. It just goes against the grain of what we expect, the state to be doing and state to be overseeing. So I think it's really hard to reconcile that. I also think there's this inability to be able to now trust is going to cause so much more anxiety. We have an ageing population. The issue of aged care, whether it's residential or whether it's at home-based, is something that more Australians are thinking about than ever before. Now that we have to actually start thinking about, well, how are we going to configure safety in home, in institutions, is It's going to require more funding. It's going to require input from experts like who we've been speaking to actually guide that, because the system is broken.
Can I ask you, Catherine, and then I'll pop over to Dennis. I've got a question for him. As a result of Anne Connolly's reporting, we know that the Department of Health collected about 3,700 cases of abuse over 10 years, right? And yet there's no information about who were the offenders. Were they residents, fellow residents? Were they staff? Were they ever charged? What time of night did this happen? Did they all happen in one particular place? Was it the non-profit? Why do we have that basic information?
Alan, it's an enormous issue. I mean, at the moment we know that aged care services only have to report unlawful sexual contact if it's perpetrated by a person who doesn't have cognitive impairment. So we know that these alleged assaults are perpetrated by someone who's not cognitively impaired. And I think one of the problems, or one of the frustrations that I have, is that the information is collected, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't see it being used to identify patterns, and then and to shape policy and education for prevention. And I think it takes us back to the question, why are we gathering that data? Well, surely that data is being gathered to prevent sexual assault of older women. And so it needs to be, that's only, it's not a full quality circle. We gather the data and then we have to use it for education, for policy, for prevention strategies, because I think it's really important that aged care service providers are given the resources they need to do their job well.
It's interesting. Let me turn to Dennis. Dennis, the response, let me tell you, of providers, whether they're in the not-for-profit sector or in the for-profit sector, has been the same. Look, there'd just be way too much paperwork if we were to get into the business of mandatory reporting, which does make you wonder why there would be that much paperwork, mandatory reporting for everybody. It's interesting, governments spend a lot of time courting the older vote, and yet political parties have to, major political parties have to be dragged kicking and screaming to this issue.
Yes, well, that's true, and it's this revelation, well, a series of revelations that we've had in Australia in recent years, that our institutions are failing. We saw it with the banks, we saw it with the sexual misconduct in the church and other charitable organisations. Now we've got these two new Royal Commissions, one that's up and running into aged care, and the new one that was announced in the budget into disability services. These are all going to reveal enormous dysfunction within the systems, the variety of systems. And you're quite right. We've heard of this stuff. It's been reported. Just in the same way that Adele Ferguson was reporting on the banks and the financial institutions in Fairfax and the ABC, Rick Morton has been reporting in the Australian on aged care for years, and yet nothing happens. Now, it's good that we're having Royal Commissions, but whoever wins the election on May 18, I'll tell you, they are going to have some big challenges in terms of fixing problems that are going to be revealed by these Royal Commissions, especially these two that are running into aged care and disability services.
Jason and Stan, before I go back to Sam in Perth, let's think about what's just been said. These people literally don't count. If you have dementia, and think about that, Stan. Well, people not counting.
Well, I think this goes to something that we've been talking throughout the program, and I think there is a common thread with all of this. We talk about inequality and fairness and getting a go. Jason mentioned the zeitgeist, what people are feeling right now, and I think this idea that people don't matter feeds into this blowback against neoliberalism. The idea, as Margaret Thatcher said, it's the economy, and through the economy you change our souls, that there is no community or society, there is just the individual. And I think we've seen the limits of that, and I think that feeds into all of this blowback against institutions, the Royal Commissions into banks, the Royal Commissions into the church, this Royal Commission, even what happened with our cricketers, and this sense that they had sold out out and
Right.
let us down. And I think that is part of what's going to drive this election. It's what's driving elections everywhere. At this idea that we have exhausted the model and that the individual has gone as far as it can go, and we need to reclaim a sense of community, that we don't just put people into homes and forget about them, and that we can trust in our institutions that are accountable to us in our communities. And I think that is the zeitgeist you're talking about, Jason.
And I think that this issue of the breakdown of trust that people have in institutions that we should be trusting, our politicians, our leaders. I mean, who do we turn to for ethical leadership now? As a young person, as a young Australian, who do you look to for moral, ethical leadership if it's not the church, if it's not our healthcare institutions, if it's not our political leaders, if it's not your sporting idols? Who is it?
And if our families are under stress, working, both parents working, some working several jobs, insecurity in the workforce, high mortgage stress, children who can't buy a house, this all feeds into this idea that what we've got just isn't working. And I don't know if there is a big narrative from either party that speaks to that necessarily.
And perhaps that is beyond all the thing around tax cuts and inequality and fairness, the political party who is vaguely successful in restoring people's trust in themselves and also in institutions, I think will do extremely well for a long
Let
time.
me
And can we just say, I don't think that's going to happen in 5 weeks.
Yeah. Catherine, can I turn back to you? So there's a couple of quick issues I want to dash through. One is what I was putting to Stam, which is what you were saying before, just to note that there's no collation of information about sexual abuse or alleged sexual abuse of people who have dementia. They quite literally don't count. Is it possible to work out whether or not a woman has been sexually abused if she has dementia, or do you have to just say, we can't get to the bottom of that, she has dementia?
Look, it's really difficult, Alan, because it's really complex, particularly if you've got somebody who can't report. And then we know from the broader community that even for women who don't have a cognitive impairment, that pressing charges around a sexual assault is a thing that's difficult anyway. So in this context, it is much more difficult. But I take the point from a number of panel members too about who can we trust, and I feel that what today the ABC is doing, what the Drum is doing by opening up this conversation, is helping to restore trust by let's have this conversation. Old age is not a protective factor against sexual assault. And this will intimidate and frighten some older women and their family members as well too. But I think given this is happening anyway, it has to be spoken of. It is an inconvenient truth, but it has to be spoken of because that is a protective factor against sexual assault. We know that when service providers and family members are listening, when they know this is possible, when they are listening, that helps prevent sexual assault. And even if it's somebody who's then going on to perpetrate a sexual assault against a second person and a third. So we have to listen, and I think what we're doing right here, right now, is opening up those conversations, and it's incredibly important.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Catherine Barrett is the founder. If we could just wind that audio back, he's the founder and director of Celebrate Ageing.